Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Contested Realm. My name's Jesse Muehlman-Marshall, and I'm here with Sean Goodison from the Sorcery team, who's going to talk us through the changes in the new rulebook and what you might expect to see when you sit down at an event at your local store. So, Sean, what's your involvement in the team, and what's been your involvement in this rulebook revamp?
I'm one of the designers, part of the design team at Eric's Curiosa, and I, for the last few months, have kind of been heading up our efforts to update the rulebook into what is now our 2024 rulebook.
And why is there a 2024 rulebook? For players who have been playing with the existing rulebook, they've probably noticed a few things that could have been clarified, but what was the team's intent behind this refresh for the 2024 version?
It's definitely to answer a bunch of those questions that keep coming up. Last year, we were providing kind of incremental updates to the rulebook. But what we really wanted to do moving into 2024 is to be able to provide a solid rulebook with provide some confidence to players that this is going to be stable for a good amount of time, like 6-12 months, before we release another version of the rulebook. And so people can rely on this idea that they know the rules, and if they go along to a tournament or something like that, there won't have been a surprise update last week that changed something that they weren't aware of. So this is to provide some of that confidence to players that they can have a read through this and know that things won't be shifting under their feet for a good while.
Fantastic. And I know there's been a lot of play through the online leagues as well as through stores, and lots of people throwing feedback to the team. So it's great to see all of the changes that have been made here and all the thinking that's gone into this new rulebook. And as you say, I think players who read through this, and hopefully after this video where we're going to talk through the key changes, they'll be able to sit down at events hopefully for a good while to come, knowing that, as you say, they've got some solid ground underneath them from a rules perspective.
Yeah, and that's a really good point about all of the feedback coming in too, because taking a few months, like I think the last rulebook we released was in August, taking a few months to process all of that feedback and actually see which stuff was kind of maybe gut reactions to things that were emerging in the meta, and then maybe died down a little bit and turned out not to be as big of an issue as originally thought. It gives us a bit of time to kind of process all of that feedback that is coming in. But as you said, we've been keeping an eye on a lot of those different avenues.
Fantastic. And I think one that players who've been following the rules discussions and channels on the Discord since before the Kickstarters would have been aware of is this idea of a storyline system, which had been called a timeline at various points. Do you want to talk us through what the storyline is and what this addition to the rulebook adds to the game?
Yeah, so this is something that we had kind of talked about with people through the league, or through this is the TTS league, or through kind of the rules discussion channel, and it is the resolution system that kind of sits behind all of Sorcery's mechanics. The storyline system,
shotting the giant shark as the archetypal example.
Giant shark is probably the worst offender when it comes to the storyline system. Not only a terror of the deep, but also a terror of our game mechanics. Because it turns out that allowing something to move multiple steps often during your opponent's turn introduces some complexity to the game. But the storyline system is essentially our resolution system. It kind of this version of the rulebook introduces on paper for the first time how spells and abilities essentially place a number of events on this storyline that then begins to resolve. And the storyline can be interrupted at various stages with triggered abilities like a shark smelling blood in the water. And so sometimes more events will be added to the timeline based on those triggered abilities. And sometimes if those triggers, if there are multiple triggers happening at the same time, triggered off the same event, the storyline system is there to kind of help resolve those conflicts of deciding, okay, both of these things are triggering off the same thing. Which one gets precedence? Who gets priority?
And the simplest example of that, or perhaps the most common example of that, is going to be abilities that are going to trigger when a unit enters a location or enters a site. So how does the storyline, just in brief summary for our players, how does the storyline treat that if there were perhaps two effects that were to trigger when a unit entered a site or a location?
Yeah, so the brief summary is essentially you already have a lot of agency during your own turn, and so when it comes to triggered abilities, we hand that priority off to the non-active player. So if there are two triggered abilities that happen at the same time, one that belongs to one of my units or one of my cards, and one that belongs to one of yours, if it's my turn, you actually get to activate your stuff first, or have your triggers resolve first on the timeline, followed by mine.
Okay. And if there are, say, two effects of mine that are going to be added to the timeline and one of yours, do I similarly get to resolve both of mine if it's your turn?
Yeah, so if an individual player has multiple triggers of their own, when it comes to their turn to do those triggers, so in this case, if it's my turn, you've got a number of triggers that would happen at the same time, you can basically put those in whatever order you wish.
Okay.
And
fantastic.
The interesting thing with the storyline is that this is there to cover kind of what are sometimes very corner case rules, and so it's one thing that I always keep in mind when I'm talking about the storyline with people, is that the amount of times that you will find situations where Jesse has two triggers and I have two triggers and they're all trying to interact at the same time, those instances are quite rare.
They are.
But on those times when that does happen, the storyline system now is there to provide some answers.
Fantastic. And I think players will no doubt continue to have questions about this aspect because, as you say, it does affect those most corner cases of the rules that come up the least often. So if players do have questions or queries about it, what's the best way for them to try and get some advice about that?
Yeah, certainly. The one place to check out was obviously the FAQs that we have on each card on Curiosa. There are some of these that over the next few weeks we will be looking at updating based on not just the storyline system, but a couple of the other changes that we'll talk about in a second. But the other place is, of course, you can jump in on the Discord, and we have a rules channel there that is frequented by a couple of, number of people on the design team are regularly checking in there, but there's also, I'd say, at least half a dozen quite dedicated community members who are really, really good at making themselves available and answering questions around the clock, especially when here in New Zealand we aren't necessarily online at the same time as other people.
Absolutely. It's been a pretty amazing thing to watch the dedication of community members in that space. So as Sean says, there is always, or almost always, someone online on Discord ready to answer a question or do their best to help you out if the FAQ doesn't have the answer yet. But Sean, moving on from the storyline, one of the other really big changes as far as players are concerned, or people who've already been playing events or playing in leagues, is moving to defend. How has moving to defend changed in this new version of the rulebook?
So we've looked to actually simplify the way that this is presented in the rulebook. And originally we were kind of trying to protect players from themselves a little bit. But now it's presented just very simply. When an attack takes place, the non-active player in this instance can have any of their units that are able to move to that location can tap to move there and defend against the attack.
So the main difference there is that it's going to allow units that have movement plus X or are able to move freely to use those abilities while defending, where they previously could only take one step. Is that right?
Yeah, precisely. So those very, very mobile minions basically just got a pretty big buff when it comes to defending. Because
things like a Cloud Spirit or a Peregrine Apparition, those sorts of minions that have movement plus X, they were useful for finishing off perhaps an enemy avatar that was at death's door that was trying to run away, but they weren't quite so good on defense where they, whereas now they can actually cover the ground pretty well from a defensive perspective.
Yeah. This is an interesting one because, as I mentioned before, the old rule about a unit only being able to defend something that was one step away was something that we kind of put into place to try and prevent players from hitting those like gotcha moments where maybe you're playing someone more experienced than you and you go to send a unit in to attack, and then because of this movement plus X, they come swooping in with a Cloud Spirit and block something that you weren't expecting to be blocked. But what we're actually finding is the opposite, is that players expect those units to be mobile, not just on their own turn, but on their opponent's turn. And so this is one of those changes that we've made to kind of fit what we're seeing is intuitive for new players.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I've certainly found that in my store as well with players. It's been one that has caused a lot of questions. So I think it'll be a lot simpler for people to understand that what's printed on the card is what it does on your turn and on the opponent's turn.
Yeah, and that's the big benefit there, is we were able to simplify the whole kind of defend basic ability down a little bit to just say, no, if they can move to the location where the attack is happening, go for it.
Fantastic. The next one is projectiles, and this is another one that projectiles come up really often. You know, you got grapple shot, firebolts, all these really commonly played cards in constructed games. All of them launch projectiles, and the change to projectiles is potentially quite significant. Do you want to talk us through what's changed there?
Sure. Again, some of this was trying to simplify the rules a little bit for newer players. Bit of a focus here in the update, as you can tell. And one of the rules around projectiles that was often kind of a sticking point was this idea that you could choose whether you were shooting it from where you were standing, or you could start it from, some distance away. And that took a bit of explaining, especially to new players. You'd get things like, so I can start it one step away, but then I pick to the right as my cardinal direction to shoot the projectile. You'd run into a bunch of these bits of confusion like that. And so simplifying this all down, the new projectile rule is basically, if something shoots a projectile, it starts from that unit, or possibly a site. We've got Rivers of Flame out there.
Yes.
Starts from that location and travels out in one cardinal direction. So very, very simple there. And then with this caveat of the projectiles will always ignore allies at that starting location. So you still kind of get a bit of that flavor of, if I'm standing here with my bodyguard or something, I can still fire off some firebolts and they won't burn my friend. But now it's a little bit easier to defend against those projectiles.
And it's also, as you say, much easier to describe to new players.
Yeah.
Because that idea of it can either start in either of these two locations already introduces a lot of confusion. Whereas I think the idea of it goes in a cardinal direction from where it starts, but you can elect to avoid the allies at that starting location, though not allies further down the road. That is intuitive for people, and I think it'll make sense.
Yeah, we often have these conversations in the office or over chat where it's like we're talking about these rules and seeing if they're intuitive or not, and we kind of got into this thing of we're talking about projectiles and asking, okay, so what's the story that's happening here? And the story with the previous projectile rules was kind of either, okay, I'm shooting my fireball, but I'm curving it around the enemy who is right in my face so that I can hit the avatar. Or the alternate story is I'm running a circle around the enemy that's in my face, getting to the edge of the desert that I'm in, throwing my fireball, and then kind of coming full circle back to where I started with the enemy in the way. And so those kinds of stories are a lot less intuitive than just saying, no, if someone's right up in your grill, the projectile's going to hit them.
Yeah, No, it makes sense. And as you say, there are cards like Grapple Shot, which are definitely at the stronger end of the current constructed metagame, and I don't think it hurts things to have them perhaps just brought down ever so slightly in power level or flexibility.
Yeah, it's something that we kind of had an eye towards, because we only want to ever errata a card as kind of a last resort. And for something like Grapple Shot, which people love playing, and it's a really fun card thematically and mechanically, this just provides a little bit of counterplay to people, where they can put a defender up ahead of them and trust that it's going to actually block that shot. So you don't run into a very typical play, which is, oh, well, I'll move my avatar, or I'll move my unit into the same location as your defender, and then I can just Grapple Shot past them, which is a very, very common way that we saw games ending.
Yeah, absolutely. So look, I think it's a really great change, and I think a lot of newer players in particular are going to very much welcome it. And if you're at your store playing with projectiles, just make sure to keep that in mind. It's always going to start at the starting location, but you can avoid allies who are at that location.
Yeah.
The next one is stealth, and this is a really good one,
before
I think, for players.
Before we jump onto stealth, there's a little kind of addendum to the projectile rules.
Sure.
Which is that, again, talking about like what stories are we telling with these cards?
Oh, ranged, yes.
Yeah, ranged, the keyword has slightly changed. We're looking ahead for future card designs and future sets and that kind of thing. We want to be able to design cards that, let's say you've got a guy with a really big shield. I'm just making this up on the spot. Don't read into it too much. We've got guy with a really big shield, and we want him to, stop projectiles like a firebolt or a fireball from going past him, or maybe he blocks them, and so people on his at his location don't get hit. We started thinking through this kind of design and going, oh well, really that should block ranged attacks too, right? These ranged strikes that we had happening through the keyword, and it made more sense for us to consolidate the ranged keyword and projectile to basically run off the same mechanic, instead of having them be separate and then have this big shield dude have to spell out, like, protects from
range strikes as well.
Strikes and projectiles. It's like, no, they're all projectiles.
And the other element to that is allowing the rules to have a simple way to express range that is longer than just adjacency, to have range that can strike 2 steps away by adding that number.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a tweak
cool as well.
But again, kind of opens up that option in the future of, you could have the super longbowman with a range 2.
Belmont very longbowman.
Yeah.
Yeah. Fantastic. And so stealth, as I mentioned, is sort of the next place that there's been a bit of a tweak. And this is something that I've actually observed players doing intuitively anyway, which is putting a token or some kind of reminder on a unit that has stealth and then removing it once it loses stealth. How did the design team come to this, and what's the change actually going to be in practice for players?
Yeah, so it was something we kind of noticed as well, where stealth, unlike pretty much all of the other keyword abilities, was something that could be lost, and once it was lost, it's essentially like you've erased the keyword from that card. And seeing people do exactly that, put like a bead on the card or something like that to track. And so it seemed natural that we should probably at some point supply a token, but a token, much like a lot of our other effects in the game, seems to be the best way to keep track of whether you still have stealth or not. The other big change here, two changes here. One is more of a rulebook change, which is that instead of using language, there was an old version of stealth which talked about if a unit does anything other than move or pick up or drop artifacts, they lose stealth. Instead, we've switched that over to list the actions that will break stealth. So it's a bit more specific. And the big mechanical change that we've introduced again relates back to those projectiles, where now stealth minions can basically just ignore them. So you can no longer fire blindly into the Geistwood and hit that Sneak Thief.
Yeah, that's super interesting because Dead of Night Demon is one, particularly in Limited, that does see quite a bit of play and can be quite useful. And obviously in Limited, ordinaries often meet ordinaries, and Dead of Night Demons would often find their end with firebolts being fired down the row or column. But now Dead of Night Demons will just be able to dodge out of the way of those firebolts.
Yeah, and it also fixes what a lot of people in the community rightfully reported as a bit of a weird narrative loss, where you had multiple units at the same site and you could pick out the stealth guy.
Yes, rather than the big hulking giant that's obviously standing there. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is, again, a push for narrative and kind of intuitive play, really.
In terms of the actions that players can take that will cause them to lose stealth, or that those stealth units can take, what are the key changes there? Will that now include triggered abilities, for example, which it didn't before, or does it include casting spells, which it didn't necessarily before? How do those two in particular land? Because you see those come up quite a lot.
Yeah, so triggered abilities will not break stealth on their own. If that triggered ability leads to them, well, they won't attack something, but if they deal damage, or any of those things on that list, then it will break stealth. So triggered abilities are quite safe. Passive abilities, very safe. And in terms of spell casting, because that is, it's a passive ability that allows you to do something extra. That will typically not, that won't break stealth either, unless it, again, is that very specific example of, I'm trying to think of a spell that you could cast that would actually break it, but I don't think there's very many.
Perhaps if you grapple shotted yourself.
But then in that case, it's still you doing the damage.
Yeah. So unless the spell causes you to do one of the other things on the list, it usually won't break stealth. Is that right? So something like a Firebolt, if I cast a Firebolt with my Apprentice Wizard that was stealthed, it would stay stealthed?
Yeah, correct. Because the Firebolts are the thing dealing the damage, which is kind of a general rule that we need to have for a lot of other things to make sense. And in this particular case, it means that those spellcasters, if you can get stealth onto them somehow, they've got a little bit of extra protection, and maybe you can sneak them into some areas that will give you some good lines of fire for those projectiles and things.
Interesting. And the other one that comes up a little bit is things like Colicky Dragonette's triggered ability. That was one that I had in mind. Is that a bit different to the Firebolt's example because it's the Colicky Dragonette's own ability that's dealing damage, or is the projectile that they launch still dealing the damage so they won't lose stealth?
Yeah, so the damage there is a result of their own ability, right? Instead of the ability saying, I can cast a spell, the spell places in effect, its own event on the timeline. It's doing its own thing. The Dragonettes themselves are... they are the card that is putting that event on the timeline. They are the kind of the source of that damage.
Right. So the Dragonette's ability will break stealth.
Yes, because they are the ones dealing the damage, in which case they will be revealed. Okay,
wow, that is very interesting and good for people to know. I think that question actually came up at my local tournament last week, so that's an interesting, good clarification there for you, Ross. Hope you're watching. The next change is Summoning Sickness. So another rule that, as the article says, was unintuitive for people was often when control passed, and obviously one of the most common control changing effects at the moment is Infiltrate, and that taps the minions anyway. But we've got other things like King of the Realm that perhaps some players found it unintuitive that when you played your King of the Realm, you got control of all these mortals, but then you couldn't do anything with them because they had Summoning Sickness. So that's now changed.
Yes, so this is it's one of those changes that seems pretty massive, but in effect is a little bit smaller than perhaps you expect, because as you mentioned, one of the most popular ways to steal control of minions through Infiltrate taps the minion anyway. And even playing things like King of the Realm, Puppet Master, in those instances, you'll quite often, your opponent's minions, they're probably doing something with those minions on their turn. And so unless they have just summoned them themselves and haven't had a chance to tap them, it's quite likely that they will be tapped when you take control anyway. This was one of the reasons that we decided to take this approach, is that it will have an impact, and it is a more intuitive approach, but it's also something you can kind of play around, and it's not necessarily going to break King of the Realm and suddenly make it insanely good.
Certainly going to be a well-deserved buff to Puppet Master, who I don't think has seen any play. So that's going to be an interesting one. Might make its way into a few Death Speaker lists, you never know.
Yeah, we'll see.
Some of the other changes on the list that we've seen are sort of a lot of clarifications along through the rulebook, but one that probably has a little bit more of potential impact is the change from going to Death's Door when you try to draw a card from an empty deck, now being you immediately lose the game.
Yeah. This was something that we kind of talked back and forth on quite a bit. And one of the reasons that the rule stayed the way it was for so long is just that it's very, very rare for games to get to that point, especially at the moment with Alpha and Beta being the card pool that we have access to. There is, not really a mill strategy out there where you can force someone to, run through their deck. In the future, that strategy could become viable as we design more cards and maybe start pushing into that kind of space. But at the moment, it wasn't really something that we were seeing a lot. However, in saying that, we all kind of got to a point where we agreed that, if you get to the end of one of your decks and you would draw from it, you'll just go straight to losing the game.
And just to clarify for people too, obviously at the start of your turn you have the option to draw from either deck, so if you had an empty spellbook you could still opt to draw from your Atlas until that's empty too.
Yes, so that is one of the reasons why we were like, it's perfectly safe to go here, because if you've already played out, let's say you've played 10 sites and filled your side of the board, and then you've finished going through your entire deck of spells, even with this rule, you've technically still got 10 turns of drawing from your Atlas before you will lose the game. And if you've got nothing left in your spellbook, if you can't get the game back or your opponent can't finish you off in those 10 turns, I'm not sure what's happened.
Yeah, no, it's a really good change, and it will... one thing that it will do is mean that in a stalemate there may be fewer draws, which is also not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah.
That it will be clear that eventually one player is going to win. If there's a true stalemate, everyone's gone through their spellbooks and you're just left with the avatars on the field at Death's Door, for instance, and they can't strike each other.
Yeah, you've gone completely tit for tat the whole game, removed threats as they appeared, and it's just nothing else has happened. Somehow you get to the end, then yes, one of you will definitely lose at some point.
Yep. Although, as you say, I haven't seen that happen yet in a game of Sorcery, but never say never.
Yeah, I think I've had exactly one game where we got down to there were 2 cards left in my opponent's deck, and it was a very long game with me playing a lot of water control stuff, and my opponent, who was Ruben, in this particular game, trying out a weird zombie recursion manuscript deck so that he could draw all of the cards. And even then, we finished the game with 2 cards, I think, left in his spellbook.
Yep. Yes. Well, that's a good one. I'm glad to see that. And so I think beyond that, Sean, the main ones that I'm seeing sort of throughout the rulebook so far are really clarifications and a few things, adding some definitions that needed to be there that were more in the FAQ, and the team felt that they should really be in the rulebooks and things like that. Was there anything else that stood out to you that you wanted to mention to our viewers that might come up or surprise them in an event they might play?
No, I think we've covered all of the big changes. As you said, the other things are mostly kind of small clarifications or tidying up bits of the rulebook. The only other big thing that I would point out is to those people out in the community who have been playing for a while, the contents page, table of contents, is probably going to become your best friend over the next few days, because the overall structure of the book has changed in order to introduce concepts in a basically provide a bit of a better onboarding for new players reading through the rulebook. So for those of you out there who are very familiar with the previous rulebook from August, you might find yourself going back to the table of contents a little bit more over the next few days as you kind of refamiliarize yourself with the new layout.
Fantastic. And if you do have any questions, as Sean said, you can check out the FAQ for the cards, which will be being updated over the next couple of weeks on Curiosa.io, our deck building site. And if you've got any further questions, do jump into the Discord, jump into the rules discussion channel, and either one of the team will try and get back to you, or else one of the many people and volunteers in the community who are right across the rules will be there to help answer your question as well. So thanks very much, Sean, for taking the time to take our viewers and all the players through these changes to the rulebook. It's great to have that 2024 version, and it's been wonderful to have your thoughts as well.
Oh, awesome. Thank you for running through with me.
No problem. Thanks everyone for watching. We'll see you next time.
Okay.